Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the state of North Carolina once again, because just 2 days ago we got the announcement that incumbent Republican Senator Thom Tillis is retiring and passing on a chance to run for re-election in 2026. In this video, I'm going to talk about why I think Tillis retired. I will then get into what this likely means for the state of the race in North Carolina, and then I'll talk about some options for candidates for both the Republicans now that Tillis is out of the running, as well as the Democratic Party, which is obviously hoping to flip back this highly competitive Senate seat. So, to first start on why I think Tillis is retiring, there's two main factors here, and obviously I don't know for sure, but I'm fairly confident it's one of these two things, or more likely a combination of both. The first is that Washington, D.C. is not a fun place to be right now. If you think back throughout American history, this is among the most polarized times in recent memory. And it's especially polarized compared to, say, the 80s or 90s, or in the past 100 years. It's a lot more polarized than, say, the 1950s or the late 1940s. So, in general, this country has a very deep polarization dynamic, and that obviously is at its most prevalent in Washington. And if you're a U.S. Senator who wants to be more productive or to work with members from across the aisle, it's harder now than arguably ever. And so Thom Tillis probably wasn't too happy about that. And it's only gotten worse since, and I'm not saying it's his fault, he's 1 out of 100, but it's only gotten worse since he was first elected back in 2014. And this is kind of, this is why we saw Rob Portman retire in 2022. He said he was, sick of partisan gridlock in Washington. And another factor that I think is more Tillis specific is that he might have been wary of getting a primary challenge from the right, from a more Trump-aligned candidate. And again, that isn't to say that Tillis is moderate by any means. He's certainly not. When he was first elected in 2014, he was one of the more conservative Republicans in that caucus. But he's definitely, I think that he definitely was concerned about facing opposition from someone who's closely aligned with Donald Trump. And that's because another thing I want to talk about is the Big Beautiful Bill, which Thom Tillis yesterday voted against. He was one of 3 Republicans, the other ones being Collins and Rand Paul, to vote against this bill. But, voting against a staple of the president's agenda is it's very hard to come back from that and win in a Republican primary electorate. So the fact that that's happening and the fact that I'd say the fact that Tillis voted against that kind of might have been the reason he was like, you know what, I don't want to deal with this come spring of 2026 when I have my primary. I'm going to retire, and I'm going to vote against this bill because I want to vote against the bill and not have to worry about the electoral repercussions of that come next year. And so I actually think this is interesting because Tillis earlier this year, or after Trump was elected in November of 2024, was not really showing those same signs of kind of being in opposition to Trump's agenda or, being in his final years in the Senate. Really, he actually, I think, was positioning himself to kind of be strong in a primary because he was a key backer of Kash Patel when Patel was proposed to be the FBI director, was Trump's nominee for the new FBI director position. And, prior to this, he's been pretty in step with the president's agenda. So this caught me a little bit off guard, especially because, for the past 6 to 7 months, Thom Tillis has been quite, I'd say, coordinated with Donald Trump. But I guess this is the straw that broke the camel's back, or he realized that it wasn't sustainable either way. So that is, I think, why he retired. And so with that, we're now going to look at why, or not why, but how this impacts the race, because obviously it does to a certain extent. And to start to kind of see where we're starting out on, I guess, we'll look at Thom Tillis' electoral history. And he first won the Senate seat in 2014 in what was a pretty interesting race. This was obviously 2014 was a midterm. It was Obama's second midterm, and it was a red wave. Republicans won nationally by 9%, and this was back during the days of a more lower propensity Democratic coalition. Democrats were not faring too well in the suburbs or even with super affluent educated voters. They relied on a more lower turnout coalition that worked out great for them in 2008 and to an extent in 2012. Didn't work out all too great for them in the midterms when their voters turned out a lot less than Republican voters. Kay Hagan was actually a relatively well-respected incumbent, and she actually did quite well. I mean, she only lost by 1.5 points in a state that voted for Mitt Romney 2 years prior in a way redder environment that was like 13 points redder. So this was, I think she fought pretty hard clearly here. but she still went down to Thom Tillis. And Tillis, this was a very competitive election. Actually, some people thought Kagan was going to win, but nonetheless, he got the job done. And obviously, had it been, or had he been running against a different incumbent, or had there been maybe a weaker Democratic candidate in this race, Tillis would have won by a bit more. But nonetheless, this is still an interesting victory. 2020, I think, is actually maybe arguably a little bit more impressive, just because the country as a whole was D plus 4.5 for Biden. So the country was 14%, more than that, really 15% bluer, or no, 14% bluer in 2020 than it was in 2014. And Thom Tillis actually won by a pretty similar amount, I think actually 0.2% more. And he did this despite the fact that there was a libertarian anti-Constitution Party candidate getting 3% and 1.2%. So Tillis did quite well. I thought this was actually a pretty impressive performance from him in 2020. And he was down. He was not popular. Most of his polls were not good. His ratings were never really that of a well-established senator. He was kind of barely hanging on or barely underwater. He was not someone like a Joe Manchin or a John Tester who was somewhat popular in a red state as a Democrat. Or he wasn't even like a Tammy Baldwin or a Mark Kelly who is popular in a swing state. He was just never that popular. And in 2020, a lot of people expected him to lose. He was down in most of the polling, and it was not crazy to think he was going to lose by, a couple of points. And he ended up winning. It ended up being actually, not, obviously it was close, but it wasn't like a nail biter either. I mean, he won by almost a full 2% against Cal Cunningham. So Tillis, despite the fact that he was not on paper a very good candidate and was not like that popular of a senator, he got the job done. He actually did a little bit better than Trump, which you can kind of see in this map that I'm taking from, obviously, the crystal ball at UVA Center for Politics. But basically what you can see here is that even though in the vast majority of counties and precincts across the state, Trump did better than Thom Tillis, Tillis did really well in the metro areas, right? This is Mecklenburg County. That's where Charlotte is. Tillis outran Trump basically the entire county. There's obviously a few precincts he didn't, but basically entire county, Tillis did a lot better. Also did better in some parts of Cabarrus County. And then Wake County, which is where Raleigh is, Tillis did better there as well. And in substantial parts of kind of the Research Triangle area up here, where you can kind of see areas like Durham and Greensboro and Winston-Salem were more favorable to him than Trump. But again, you look at the areas that are more rural out here in this part of the state, obviously Trump did better there. And then in most of Appalachia, except for the region surrounding Buncombe County, which is where Asheville is, Tillis did better, or Trump did better, rather. So Tillis got his strength because he did better than Trump where the population was. He did better in the areas where there were more voters, simply put, even though in most counties across the state, he lagged a bit behind Trump. But overall, it basically canceled out. He won by less than 0.4% more than Donald Trump did. And so what's this all to say? Well, it's interesting. Tillis, again, like I said, never been that impressive a candidate, never had super great approval ratings as a U.S. senator, but he got the job done twice and in two competitive races where many polls had him losing. So I think for Republicans, it isn't good news. It isn't like he's an unpopular senator that was a drag on the ticket and he's leaving now. It was more like, hey, he wasn't ever the strongest candidate, but he always found a way to win. And so Republicans kind of are in an interesting position because it's kind of like a fork in the road. They can go one of two ways. They can either nominate a strong candidate who will be as strong as Tillis would have been, maybe similarly strong, or they can nominate a really weak candidate who will potentially cost them the race. And so the avenues here are interesting. If we talk about the weaker candidates first, look no further than Mark Robinson, who lost this governor's race by a decisive 15-point margin, despite the fact that Donald Trump carried the state presidentially. This was a really bad performance from Robinson. He lost a ton of counties that Trump lost, right? We're talking, just to kind of give an example, Brunswick County, he lost by 3% and it voted for Trump by 25. So just absurd levels of ticket splitting there because Robinson was so unpopular for a number of reasons. But he is, I wouldn't say he's expressed interest in running, but he's kind of been, talking about the race. He's been saying he's glad Thom Tillis retired because Tillis is a rhino. And so, or from his perspective, Tillis is a rhino. And so Robinson might run. I wouldn't bet on it, but it's certainly, it's still in play, or still in the cards, I should say. And then Republicans also might be a little concerned if Lara Trump runs. And Lara Trump actually has publicly expressed interest in running for this Senate seat. But most Republicans fear she would not be a good candidate. I think she'd be better than Robinson, clearly, but I still don't think she'd be the best they can do. Now, they can do better, obviously. There's a couple options. And you look at these row offices, right? Uh, I like Farley, or not. I like Farley, but I think he'd be probably their best bet um, out of all the row offices. He's the current labor commissioner. He won by 6% in 2024 against a reasonable Democratic candidate in Winston. So I think Farley could be a good nominee for a statewide profile. They could also run someone from the House. Maybe someone like Mark Harris or Tim Moore. Maybe someone like I think Greg Murphy or David Rouser too. So overall, they have options, and I think anyone from their House delegation, or I think most people from their House delegation, and most of their statewide elected row officers, like, auditor, insurance commissioner, labor commissioner, one of those guys, I think would be a decent candidate for them and be maybe comparably strong to Thom Tillis. But again, Tillis leaving introduces the possibility that Republicans run someone like Mark Robinson, who would, I think, blow this race immediately. And so on the Democratic side, I think, are looking at two candidates mainly. It's either going to be Rachel Hunt, who is currently the lieutenant governor. I can actually pull her race up, luckily. She's currently the lieutenant governor. She beat Hal Weatherman. She ran a really strong race. I paid close attention to this race. She did really well. She actually did better than Kamala Harris in some of the suburbs, across the state, which is impressive to do. I think she'd be a pretty good candidate for Democrats, but they are really hoping to get Roy Cooper to run. And Roy Cooper is the former governor. He was governor from 2017 to 2025. He was the only, I think, gubernatorial, or he was the only candidate to beat an incumbent governor in 2016. I think he's actually the only candidate to beat an incumbent governor in a presidential cycle in a while. I can't think of any other governor who ran for re-election and lost. I don't believe, in a presidential year. Someone can fact check me on that, but I think the last time that happened was I think in 2016 when Roy Cooper beat Pat McCrory by like 0.4% in North Carolina. But regardless, he won a really tight race in 2016, and then he also won re-election 2020 by 5%. He outran both Biden and Cal Cunningham by pretty substantial amounts. He had high approval ratings in his tenure as governor. He was consistently more popular than Thom Tillis, and Democrats, really have been recruiting him for years, basically. And even back in 2024, when he was been considered as a vice presidential nominee, many Democrats were like, hey, hold on, maybe you should run for Senate instead. And so that would be very interesting. I guess that dynamic is very interesting because Democrats now really hope Cooper runs for U.S. Senate against whoever the Republican nominee is. And I think he'd be a strong candidate. I think he's a little bit overrated. People, I think, electorally tend to overrate governors and Senate races because they think, oh, well, they won a statewide election. They're kind of high profile. People like them. Why won't they just vote for them for Senate? But fundamentally, governors' races are different from Senate races. Just ask, Steve Bullock or Larry Hogan, who, in case you don't know, Steve Bullock was a Democratic governor of Montana. Larry Hogan was the Republican governor of Maryland. They both ran for Senate in their states and lost decisively because voters might vote for the other party for governor, but they tend to be a bit more partisan in Senate races. And oftentimes that can surprise people, but it's happened time after time again. It's happened basically every cycle. We've seen something like that. And so Roy Cooper, obviously North Carolina is a more competitive, it's a lot less, deeply partisan than, say, Montana or Maryland. It's more of a swing state, but just bear in mind that Roy Cooper wouldn't be a shoe-in to win this race. He'd have to run a good campaign, and he'd have to still win over a fair number of moderates, or at least moderate Republicans. And so that's where we are right now. I'd keep this race as a toss-up. I think a lot of it depends on Mark Robinson. If he runs and gets the GOP nomination, it's a lean to likely D race. If it's anyone else, it could stay in the toss-up. And if there's a scenario where maybe the Republicans nominate someone like Farley or a member of their House delegation who runs a strong campaign, maybe Democrats don't find, or they can't get Rachel Hunt or Roy Cooper to run. If that's the case, maybe the race goes towards Republicans. So we'll see. But this is a very interesting development, and I'm looking forward to seeing this race play out because it's going to be very interesting. So let me know what you think. Let me know who you want to run on both sides, and I'll talk to you all soon.